said this was St. Patrick's Day. I thought the reason everyone was wearing green is because this is the anniversary of the 1863 Battle of Kelly's Ford. Good Irish name that it is. And it's so appropriate tonight that, and let history record that yet another member of Seminar 9 of Irish heritage has just joined us, the whole 9 yards. But it's so appropriate on any day, but especially on this date, that we should have a presentation on the important contributions made by Irish American immigrants, especially the relatively recent immigrants of the Catholic faith who served so prominently in the American Civil War. And we're exceptionally fortunate to have as our speaker a scholar who has devoted much study to that subject. She did her own college work under the direction of some of the major scholars in the field of military history at the University of Vermont and Kansas State University, and has become a recognized expert in the field herself, from teaching at Sam Houston State University from 2000 to 2009, and she has just joined the faculty of the University of Southern Mississippi as an associate professor and a member of their Center for the Study of War and Peace. She has completed an important book on the Eagle and the Harp, the Irish soldiers in the Civil War, and she's now working on a book on Hood's Texas Brigade of the Army of Northern Virginia, which she has done research for that here at the Army Heritage and Education Center, and she expects that that book will be published within a year or so. And she's further working on a book, first-person accounts from soldiers of that brigade in coordination with our own Rick Eiserman, and veterans of our Perspectives program will recall that Colonel Eiserman was himself the Assistant Director for Historical Services here at the Military History Institute. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susanna Ural, who will give the Perspectives presentation tonight. Susanna.
Annoying women who wears a dress. So I'm going to be holding these tonight because there's nowhere to clip them. I want to thank Dr. Summers for that wonderful introduction. I hope I live up to it. And I want to thank Michael Lynch, who originally invited me for this gig, and Tommy Sherd, who kept everything running beautifully. And we've all decided Tommy now has to run U.S. Air. I am here in 9 seconds to talk with you about my book, The Harp and the Eagle. And what I want to look at is really, it's what all of my work focuses on, which is why soldiers volunteer, how their experiences in war changes them, if it changes any of their views or does not, and really if their families have any impact on them, basically what happens to them. Why do they fight? How does the fight change them? Those types of questions. And when you look at something like immigrant soldiers, when you look at an issue like that, it becomes a whole other question. And it puts a marvelous spin on the issue of soldier ideology and soldier motivation. And that's what got me into this project in the first place. And when you look at Irish Americans, historians have recognized for a long time the idea of that immigrant soldiers volunteer to prove themselves, to demonstrate their loyalty, to gain acceptance. And what we've tended to argue over the last couple decades is that that's really been overplayed. That this really becomes a post-war issue, okay? And so when you look at Irish Catholic soldiers in the mid-19th century and why they volunteered for the Union Army when the Civil War began, what you really need to look at is that for many Irishmen, military service in the Civil War related as much to their own Irish heritage as it did to preserve the Union. And that's the whole point of my book. The Harp and the Eagle is all about the fact that you have to understand that it is really dual loyalty. And as long as those two issues, the cause of Union and the cause of Ireland, the Catholic Ireland, are one, you're going to get determined and enthusiastic Irish Catholics serving in the Union Army. When those two split, you're going to run into some serious problems. Okay, and the Irish Catholics are going to run into some serious problems as well for the response to that. And that's what I'm here tonight to explain to you. Okay? Now, when you look at Irishmen and why they volunteered, okay, you can find the radical Fenians, who are your Irish nationalists. They're going to be volunteering to really, mainly to gain military experience, to go over and later liberate Ireland from British rule. Okay? Others are going to refer to opportunities they found in America. They're going to speak of their hope to save America as a future refuge for additional Irish immigrants coming over to the United States. Still others are going to volunteer for the steady pay you could earn in the Union Army. And it's a rather risky proposition. But for a common laborer who basically has no real skills, the military life offers some nice financial bounties when you sign up. It offers steady pay. It offers basic room and board. And again, there's some trade-offs when you're a Civil War soldier, but for a lot of these guys, it was a fantastic opportunity. Okay, and so you don't want to forget about those financial inspirations as well. Now, like I said, the long-standing accepted interpretation was that immigrants in general fight because they want to demonstrate their loyalty. They want to prove themselves, and that they, after they've done this, they tend to gain experience and they get embraced into the fold of America. What I found is that really very, very few Irish Catholics actually expressed that view, that motivation, when they thought about joining up in 1861, 1862. Okay? That idea developed afterwards, when Irish Catholics were frustrated by the fact that they weren't receiving any sort of recognition for their service, they weren't receiving any recognition for their sacrifice, and that really there was only a memory of what they had not done, okay, or some of the darker things that had happened. And so really what ends up happening is what I found is that most Irish Catholic soldiers were not seeking any sort of acceptance through military service. It's been completely overemphasized, okay? And that what you really have to do is look at those dual loyalty issues. And I love this print because during this parade, as the 69th New York, one of the most famous Irish units, is leaving the city, it's 1861. Michael Cavanaugh commented about the fact that he heard a man shout out in the crowd, "Remember your country and keep up its credit, boy." And what was fantastic, it was never clear, what country are you talking about? Are you talking about Ireland or are you talking about the United States? Because there are Celtic harps, there's American flags, there's everything about union. It is this wonderful embracing of union and completely forgetting about a whole bunch of the past differences that had really split those two groups. Okay? And what will help, I think, is if we take a look at some of that background as far as what's been going on in the 1850s. The political cartoon on the left is one of my all-time favorites. This is the image of immigrants in the 1850s, during the period of nativism and the know-nothings, that this is what immigrants bring. Okay, the Irish Catholic with his Irish whiskey barrel, they're stealing, I don't know if you can make that out, but what they're stealing is a ballot box. It says ballot on there, and the lager beer, with the German, and that this is the image. Okay, and the one on the right is a fantastic demonstration where you have this immigrant coming in, and normally it's welcome, but Uncle Sam is saying, no, not really. You're bringing Sabbath desecration there on the barrel, and he's carrying bags of poverty and disease. There's kind of a bomb on the back written with anarchy. That this is what the image is. That this is what Irish Catholics bring into the country. Okay? And really, part of this goes to the age-old split between Protestants and Catholics. Part of it goes to the image that Catholic Americans, Nativists argued that they could never really be true Americans. They could never be the virtuous citizen because their first loyalty would always be to the church, in particular to the Pope. And that, for example, the Pope had sided with Mexico in the Mexican-American War. And that the Pope had not a lot of the revolutionaries in the 1848 uprisings in Europe. So that, really the image is that Irish Catholics in particular, especially because they are to relinquish their past as Irish Catholics, their heritage, will never really be true Americans. Okay? And what's interesting is this is a very important issue in the 1850s, okay, that just literally the years leading right up to the war. And so what happens when the war begins in 1861, the question becomes, how exactly are these men going to respond? Okay? And so it helps to look at a couple of these guys and see what they said. Thomas Francis Meagher is there on the left. Okay? Meagher was a revolutionary in the 1848 uprising in Ireland, a very small uprising, but when you do take up arms against the crown, that's never well received. Ends up being arrested, prosecuted, banished, escapes, comes to the United States, and really makes a name for himself within the New York Irish Catholic community. And when the war broke out, Marr is one of your classic examples of those dual loyalties. He argued duty and patriotism prompt me to support the Union, the Republic that gave us an asylum, an honorable career, that is the mainstay of human freedom the world over, is threatened with disruption. It is the duty of every liberty-loving citizen to prevent such a calamity at all hazards. Above all, it is the duty of us Irish citizens who aspire to establish a similar form of government in our native land. It is not only our duty to America, but also to Ireland. We could not succeed in our effort to make Ireland a free republic without the moral and material aid of the liberty-loving citizens of these United States. That aid we might rely upon receiving at the proper time, but now, when all the thoughts and energies and resources of this noble people are needed to preserve their own institutions from destruction, they cannot spare either sympathy, arms, or men for any other cause. And this is from a guy who was fairly hesitant. I mean, when that period of secession from Lincoln's election into the firing on Fort Sumter by April of '61, Marr was very hesitant on exactly what exactly Irish Catholics should do in this war. Once the war begins, he is clearly saying there is a link here between the two. Okay? Michael Corcoran on the right is another classic example. Corcoran is a very active member of the Fenian organization. He ended up having to flee Ireland, come to the United States because he was suspected for those types of activities. And he's probably better known than Marr. He tended to garner more respect as kind of the more thoughtful, leader within the Fenian circles than perhaps Marr, who was much more of Marr of the sword. He was the speaker, he was the orator, he was the one that could really rally people to the movement. Corcoran's interesting. He addresses the Fenian Brotherhood on the 21st of April, shortly after Sumter, 1861, urges all members who are not part of the 69th New York to avoid service in that unit or any other. He says it's essential for the Fenians in America to continue their focus on Ireland, avoid anything that might diminish their ranks. Corcoran argued that there were plenty of Irish serving the 69th New York who were not Fenians, so there was no need to deplete the organization's force. For those joining him, however, Corcoran said, all is not lost. Quote, we will not be the worse for a little practice, which we engage in with the more heart, because we know that it will be serviceable on other fields. Okay? And it's a fascinating stance for a man who's going to be heralded for serving very bravely for the Union cause. But again, those dual loyalties. Okay? Peter Welsh, the third name there. Welsh is a great story. In 1862, it's the fall of 1862, the war's been going on for over a year. He's visiting family in Boston. He's actually Canadian-born. He married an American woman. They're visiting family in Boston. And it's never entirely clear from the record, but basically I think what happened is what occasionally happens when large families all get together. And he decided he needed to escape the house for a little while, ended up going to a bar, went on a bender. When he woke up, he had spent all of his money. He was absolutely mortified. He couldn't go home to his wife and tell her this, and so he enlisted. Yeah, we don't know quite exactly what her response was, and we can only imagine. But he joins up with the Company K of the 28th Massachusetts, which joins the Irish Brigade that year. And by the summer of 1863, okay, you have a guy, Welsh, who, there aren't a whole lot of ideological motivations that put Peter Welsh into Union Blue, okay? It was basically doing penance that made him join the military. But he's one of our most profound and thoughtful enlisted men when he's really reflecting in 1863 about what the war means to him. He's a veteran at this point, he's a color sergeant, and Welsh insists America is Ireland's refuge, Ireland's last hope. He says, destroy this republic and her hopes are blasted. When we are fighting for America, we are fighting for the interests of Ireland, striking a double blow, cutting with a two-edged sword. For while we strike in defense of the rights of Irishmen here, we are striking a blow at Ireland's enemy and oppressor. England hates this country because of its growing power and greatness. She hates it for its Republican liberty, and she hates it because Irishmen have a home and a government here and a voice in the councils of the nation that is growing stronger every day, which bodes her no good. And so by the summer of '63, Welsh is the dual loyalty classic reason for motivating, okay, for enlisting. Joseph Tolley was in the 69th New York, and Tolley is one of the rare exceptions that I found for a guy who did hint at the idea that, you know, maybe through military service we will gain a little respect. He really liked the idea of Irishmen serving in Irish units. So if they win and they do well, Irishmen will get the credit. He's one of the only guys who I found actually making that argument, that old school kind of argument, that we'll fight and then people will appreciate us for what we do. But even Tolley also comes out saying that it's also about gaining military experience for Ireland. It's also about Ireland's hopes within America. Okay? And the last guy there, William O'Grady, is one of my favorites. He served in the British Army in India. His father was an officer, so he's second generation in the British Army. Resigns his commission, shows up in New York City in December of 1861. He's walking through the streets when he comes across some guys who are recruiting for the 88th New York, which is one of the most famous regiments in the Irish Brigade. And he isn't off the boat for 2 hours. When he describes it, there's a huge record of his life after the war. And he just is absolutely mesmerized with stories of the Irish Brigade and the wild geese and this military heritage of the Irish, and he signs up 2 hours in New York City, and he's ready to go. The Irish support, though, for the war will fade when Ireland and the Union's interests come into conflict. Okay? As hundreds of Irish Americans die on battlefields and thousands more return home as invalids, their communities are going to begin to wonder how many Irishmen will be left for the future war to liberate their ancestral homeland. Irish newspapers are going to conclude page after page after page of terse stories about what is happening. Okay, and is this necessarily the route we want to go? And what's going to happen is their church and political leaders are going to be fairly split as these views start to waver, as Irish Catholic communities start to wonder, oh, wait a minute, is this really our war? Are Irish boys just being sacrificed? Are we really being appreciated? Okay? The gentleman on the left there, if you don't recognize him, that's Archbishop Hughes of New York. He's really the voice of Catholic America. He's the Archbishop in New York City, but he is really the leading voice of the Irish Catholic Church in America. He always signed his name. He would put a cross right after his name, and he was often known for his rather, how do you put this nicely, brusque approach to things. He was known as Dagger John. And Archbishop Hughes was pretty clear in being very suspicious of exactly how the Irish Catholic community was being used in this war. And that he becomes this kind of leading voice and this leading symbol within the Catholic community of we're not entirely sure if we're going to keep supporting this war effort. Now, one of my other favorite stories has to do with Richard Yates of Illinois. Yates had to deal with just all the time complaints by Irish Catholics that they were not as able to serve in Irish units. Okay, I'll put a print up here in a minute, but there's Mulligan's Irish Brigade was recruited out of Chicago. So you have examples like that. But for a lot of Irishmen in the West, they didn't have that opportunity to serve in Catholic units, in Irish Catholic units in particular. And so Yates would get these letters, one after another, of just, we're being abused, we're being mistreated, we're being unappreciated, I need to be transferred. And just before we cry in our beer too much about people being abused and just unappreciated, and the whistling, I don't know. It's just God. He appreciates the talk. Yates gets these letters of these Irishmen just saying, and by the way, we know how to vote. We know how to get you elected. We know how to kick you out of office. I mean, so they're not stupid. They fundamentally have figured out how the democratic process works. And so, again, I don't want to paint too much of this image of victimhood, that they very much are aware of how the process works. But what starts to happen by the time you're running through 1861 and into 1862 is that as the fighting on the peninsula continues, as you start to get some problems on the home front, as you get a lot of casualties coming in, this becomes a question of exactly how are Irish Catholic soldiers being used? Are they being treated equally with native-born troops? Okay? And what ends up happening is you get these reports of nativist prejudice within the Army. One member of the Irish 9th Massachusetts complained that the New York Herald's coverage of the Battle of Hanover Courthouse purposely omitted any reference to the heroism of Irish soldiers in that struggle. He said, I had, it appears, erroneously labored under the impression that the age of narrow-mindedness, bigotry, and intolerance had passed away. I had thought that the heroic valor and bravery of the Irish soldiers had sufficiently manifested itself during the war to disarm those prejudices that were so long entertained against us and ensure for us that even-handed justice, which even those against whom we are combating are forced to accord. Okay? And what also happens is recruiters for the Union Army notice similar problems. These complaints as early as the spring of 1862. Okay? An Indiana recruiter complained that the few Irish they could get to volunteer for Irish companies became disgruntled when they discovered they would serve under native-born officers and would often refuse to muster into service. Okay? This wasn't the case with all Irish enlistment. Spring of 62, it's still fairly strong. But still, even General Marr faces resistance with his efforts recruiting in New York City that summer. Again, this is the summer of 62. Okay? Marr manages, again, this is Marr of the sword. This is the man who is known for his ability to move crowds and inspire men to go do great deeds. Marr manages to attract only 250 recruits in the summer of 1862 to the Irish Brigade, despite added bounties to tempt Irishmen of New York. Okay? David Cunningham, who was a captain and Irish Brigade historian and staff officer, he recalled that the result of the few recruits Marr gathered offered an, quote, almost imperceptible benefit to the unit. And Marr confessed that his difficulties were numerous and most vexing and embarrassing. The Army of the Potomac has to fight desperate open enemies in front, but he was fighting an equally difficult struggle against, quote, an army of implacable conspirators in the rear. He suspected, correctly, that members of the Irish-American community opposed the Lincoln administration and were making a determined effort to discourage Irish enlistments. Okay? And again, Marr was right. There was a captain by the name of James Turner in the 88th New York. He was an aide to Marr. And his father had been out of work, and his father had written him a letter that he was thinking of joining up. They would get some bounties for the family. This would be a way to bring in some money. And Turner writes a letter back to his father saying, you've got to be kidding me. Okay, don't even think about it. He writes, as to any idea you may have of joining the Army, give it up at once. Unless a man occupies a position among the very highest, the amount of vulgarity, profanity, and utter tyranny that exists is to a man of any regiment and religious training, such as you are, a perfect hell. Then, when I see young, strong men about me who hold commissions, sinking daily and fast under the mingled fatigue, exposure, and want of proper nourishment, it makes one wish that never a friend of his should be placed in like predicament. Think of lying, eating, in daily life in a small tent with from 7 to 10 men, none of whom are the cleanest or with any pretense to education or refinement, then being cursed and cuffed about by some vulgar wretch in authority. No, the idea of soldiering in any capacity you must give up. Okay? Now, letters like these will be combined with reports of continued anti-Catholic prejudice that's going to create continued problems for raising the number of recruitments that the Irish Brigade needs to fill the losses that they're sustaining during that fight on the peninsula. So what you're also going to run into, though, are finances on the home front, which means what I'm talking about there is that economically there is an incentive for people to join up. But the problem is that the reports coming in is that when Irish Catholic soldiers are serving, they're being asked to do things other troops are not being asked to do. They're suffering in ways that other troops are not suffering, and they are not being appreciated for their service. Okay? One of the big turning points, really, I would argue, the beginning of the real strong questioning within the Irish Catholic community starts with Antietam. Okay? And particularly Antietam linked with the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? At the Battle of Antietam on the 17th of September in 1862, the Irish Brigade, with its fighting down there near Bloody Lane, suffers incredible losses. The 63rd and 69th New York lost 60% of their force. And by the way, among the New York casualties were 75 of those men that Marr had recruited just before that in the summer when he had been on duty in New York City. The losses, in many ways, are celebrated, that this is what happens to elite units. They are sent in, they are asked to do amazing things, and with that will come casualties. Okay? The problem, though, is that a lot of Irish Catholics are going to start to view this as, yeah, but are Irish Catholics asked to do things that native-born soldiers are not asked to do? And what you're going to start to see are criticisms of Marr himself increasing. One of his own sergeants, an Irish sergeant, describes Marr as a gentleman and a soldier, but he wanted to gain so much praise he would not spare his men. But the biggest problem with Antietam is when you link it with the Emancipation Proclamation. And when President Lincoln announces this on the 22nd of September, it is hugely unpopular within the Irish Catholic community. There are economic fears that 3.5 to 4 million slaves, unskilled laborers, are going to come north and try and take the only jobs that Irish Catholics seem to be able to take if they can get them. So there's basic economic fears. There's also the idea that to be white, no matter how poor you were on the socioeconomic ladder, still gave you a certain amount of power in 19th century America. And to be black was to be associated with slavery. Even if you were free, you were still associated with that institution. And that you take slavery out of the equation,
and Irish Catholics and freedmen are going to be down at the bottom altogether. So part of it's racism, and again, this is across the board in the 19th century, and part of it is economic fears as well. But the Irish Catholic community responds incredibly strongly, negatively, to the Emancipation Proclamation. Under the Republicans, this is from the Democratic Chicago Times, African Americans would, quote, take the place of white laboring men. And the editors reported that 2 local abolitionists had declared that foreign-born citizens should expect no rights in this country. The Times went on to argue where abolitionism most abounds, the hatred of foreigners is most intense. And Irishmen back east agreed. New York Archbishop John Hughes, the leading voice, again, of Irish Catholics in America, warned that we Catholics, and a vast majority of our brave troops in the field, have not the slightest idea of carrying on a war that costs so much blood and treasure just to gratify a clique of abolitionists. Irish-American judge in New York City, Charles Patrick Daly, was an avid supporter of the Irish Brigade, active recruiter. He warned that he might, quote, wash his hands of the whole matter, and he insisted that, quote, recruiting was difficult enough now because of the everlasting Negro question. The Boston Pilot, which is the Catholic Church's, basically it's the newspaper coming out of the Catholic Church in Boston, declared the proclamation, quote, violently opposed to the Constitution and warned that the president's actions would only lengthen the conflict. Adding to this is when President Lincoln relieves General McClellan of command, who was a huge favorite within the Army of the Potomac and particularly with the Irish Brigade and some of the other Irish units. Irish Americans with the Pilot argued that Lincoln's decision was tragic, warned that, quote, the fate of the Republic is growing darker every day. The brave general who made the Grand Army has been removed in disgrace. They argued that at one time we did support Lincoln, but then he had the full promise of constitutionalism about him. He has changed, and so have we. It is now every man's duty to disagree with him. So amid these feelings of anger and frustration, you have the Irish Brigade marching toward the Rappahannock for the Battle of Fredericksburg on the 13th of December, which did not bode well for the Army of the Potomac in general. And again, I don't want to give the impression that the Irish Brigade and Irish units, whether it's Mulligan's Brigade or the 9th Massachusetts or any, are the only ones taking casualties. The problem is that the Irish Catholic community is going to suspect that they're being singled out. They are being sacrificed when Native men are not. And they are a population that is very well aware of past prejudices and very well eager to respond to it. Okay? The Irishmen of the Second Corps at Fredericksburg, the 69th New York there lost 16 of their 18 officers at Fredericksburg, 112 of 210 men killed, wounded, and missing. They were well on their way to earning the reputation of the New York Regiment to lose the most men in action. The 116th Pennsylvania lost most of its officers and men, while the 28th Mass lost 158 men on the field. The Irish Brigade estimated that it had taken 45% losses at Fredericksburg, and after the battle, the brigade could muster 263 men. So again, it's not that they're not fighting. They are. They're fighting and they're dying. The question is, how are they going to respond to this, and how are the home communities going to respond? Father William Corby, who was an Irish Catholic chaplain with the 88th New York, was horrified by the suffering of the Irishmen under his care. He declared that the place into which Marr's brigade was sent was simply a slaughter pen. Captain William J. Nagel of the 88th New York reported the whole-souled enthusiasm with which General McClellan inspired his army is wanting. His great scientific engineering skill is missing, and his humane care for the lives of his men is disregarded. We are slaughtered like sheep, and no result but defeat. John England, an Irish Catholic in the 9th New York, described the carnage at Fredericksburg as one of the most fruitless, destructive, and disastrous battles ever fought on the old or new continent. He was shocked by the treatment of the wounded, who were, quote, thought no more of than a pack of used-up, maimed dogs and treated no better. And hundreds are stiff and cold in death today, who would be living and might recover if properly treated and attended. And by the way, that letter was published in the New York Irish American, so it's going to be read throughout the Irish community in New York. And so the problem becomes, this image coming through to the home front, is that Irish boys are reporting from the field that they are being needlessly sacrificed. And again, they're hardly the only unit that suffered horribly on Marie's Heights. It was bad all around. But the Irish Catholic community is going to worry that it's simply because they're Irish Catholic boys. Okay? Now, Marr is going to spend the spring of 1863 trying to recruit replacements for the brigade. He keeps asking for permission to go home to New York to do these recruiting duties. The problem with Marr is that he's also an avid politician, and he's using some of his time at home for political issues. and he doesn't quite report back to camp on time. He's brought up on charges of being absent without leave, and he is quickly making himself he's not an enemy, but he's certainly not a friend within the Lincoln administration. He keeps writing letters of protest. He keeps giving speeches on the home front, saying that other units are being allowed to go home to rest, to recuperate, and recruit replacements. The Irish Brigade is not, because we are Irish. The Lincoln administration isn't happy with this. The relationship starts to break down with Marr. He comes back. He leads the Irish Brigade at the Battle of Chancellorsville. The brigade numbers 521 men at Chancellorsville. And Marr is absolutely fearful that the unit's going to be disbanded. He's going to lose his command. And the honor that they have gained for themselves is going to completely disappear. Shortly after Chancellorsville, Marr writes a letter of protest to the Lincoln administration. He hasn't been receiving hardly any answers back to any of his letters all spring. It spells out the patience with which he's gone about trying to argue his case, his dedicated service, his sad frustration with the Lincoln administration, and then Marr says he must resign in protest. This letter gets an immediate response from the Lincoln administration, and they accept. Now, in fairness to Marr, okay, there was plenty of Nativist prejudice going on, absolutely. In fairness to the Lincoln administration, Marr was a superb recruiter on the home front, a superb political leader within the Irish Catholic community. He had mixed results as a field commander. And by the spring of 1863, the Lincoln administration is cracking down on a lot of their political generals. They're really getting rid of them. But as far as the Irish Catholic community at home is going to be concerned, Marr was fired because he's Irish Catholic, and he spoke up trying to defend Irish Catholics. William Nagel of the 88th New York responded, "Am I not right in saying that in any other country, the brigade which had fought and suffered as this has would be gratefully and proudly cherished, its ranks kept full, its deeds of heroism acknowledged and rewarded? We asked neither favor nor reward, only what was right, just to the government, and for the advancement and good of the cause in which we had staked life and reputation. It was denied us, and the Irish Brigade is blotted out of the Army of the Union." And this is the situation on the home front in the largest Irish Catholic communities. Those are in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia by the spring of 1863. The Boston Pilot reports, "We are an immigrant race. We did not cause this war. Vast numbers of our people have perished in it. The Irish spirit for the war is dead, absolutely dead. The Irish will never forgive the extreme want of decorum. It will remain in their memory with national bitterness as the deaths of their warriors will with national regrets. Such sentiments will have their effect." Now, as if things couldn't get worse, in March of 1863, Congress passes the Enrollment Act, which puts forward the first federal draft in American history. The problem with the Enrollment Act was twofold as far as the Irish Catholic response to it. The one was the idea that you could purchase a substitute with $300, which was about a year's wages for a common laborer. So this is where you're going to get the arguments. It's a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Okay, and that argument's going to respond very well. It's going to resonate within Irish Catholic communities who've already been suspicious of this. The other problem was a slight change in the law. Through the spring of 1863, Secretary of State William Seward had always clarified, he had been asked by the British government to clarify this, he had clarified it on numerous occasions, that unless you were a citizen, you could not be drafted. If you had declared your intent to become a citizen, he said, you don't get a passport simply by declaring your intent. Similarly, you can't be drafted, okay? Because the British government was becoming suspicious that the Union Army was simply over in Ireland recruiting men to be sacrificed, and Seward said, no, that's not the case at all. Only actual citizens can be drafted. When the Enrollment Act was passed in 1863, they changed that. They said if you had declared your intent to become a citizen, you had 65 days to leave the country. If you failed to do so, you could be drafted. Okay? And this is going to further fuel the idea that Irishmen are simply being used and recruited and abused by the federal government. The Irish Brigade fights very well, suffers a lot of casualties again, but fights very well at the Battle of Gettysburg. The problem, though, is when folks are remembering the war afterwards, nobody remembers that as far as the Irish Catholic memory of the war, as far as July of 1863 goes. What everybody will remember are the draft riots, which occur right after the Battle of Gettysburg in mid-July. Basically what happens is when the federal government started to institute the draft in New York City, common laborers combined with skilled laborers, a lot of German immigrants, Irish immigrants, came out and started to riot and protest against the draft. The reason it became a problem within the memory for Irish Catholics is because while a lot of the Germans tended then to go back to work, the skilled laborers went back to work, the Irish rioters continued through that week in July, the 13th through the 17th of July of '63. They're the ones who will be associated and linked with the burning and destruction of the African Americans' orphanage. They will be linked with the brutal deaths and beatings within the streets of New York City. That will increasingly become the memory of Irish Catholics during the Civil War. Not the Irish Brigade, not Mulligan's Brigade, not the Ninth Mass. These images will become the memories of Irish Catholics during the Civil War. And for them, what they're going to start to argue is that, and this really gets Irish Catholics in trouble, is that they're going to try and explain some of the motivations behind what happened during the riots. Rather than just come out against the violence, there's an effort to try and explain some of the anger, try and make native-born Americans understand where this is coming from. Okay? The New York Irish American claimed that the Lincoln administration had been warned of the danger they were risking in the outbreak of popular resentment and opposition, which the obnoxious character of the law would be certain to provoke. Despite this, they neither heeded advice nor warning, and the deplorable results are all that their disregard of the plainest dictates of common sense has produced. Archbishop Hughes called on all the rioters to cease their violence, but he continued to urge Irish Catholics to protest through peaceful means. And his most stinging remarks, published in the New York Times, were not for the rioters, but rather those who cited his flock and himself as entirely to blame for this violence. He did not doubt that only Irish were arrested. He argued that they were innocuous victims of our municipal laws and the favorite targets of native-born Americans. And so what you get by the late 1863 is this increasing resistance by Irish Catholics to serve in a war where the Union war effort is now completely splitting from where their interests are. The idea of fighting in a war where the Union is about not only reuniting the country but ending slavery is completely anathema to the Irish Catholic population. They absolutely do not support the end of slavery. They are horrified at the number of casualties. They are appalled by the draft. It seems to be one thing after another is convincing them that this is not their fight. Okay? By the summer of 1864, the brigade has depleted in numbers to the point where some of the soldiers within the unit are arguing that it was a brigade no longer. They wrote that it appeared that soon it would exist only in the recollections of its services and sufferings. Okay? The guys you do see showing up in the Irish Brigade by near the final stages of the war tended to be much less ideologically motivated. You don't tend to see the Fenians as active in the Irish Brigade near the end. As far as the guys who are coming in, the core members who are with it from the beginning who stay and continue to serve, you can still find them. But as far as the replacements go, mainly you have economic motivations, okay? This is one of my favorite sketches this is Castle Garden, one of the main ports of entry in New York City in the mid-19th century. And you can see not only kind of the recruiting right there on the docks, but also how you have German language and English language recruiting posters up, trying to convince folks of exactly how well you can do. And again, before we look at these poor Irish Catholics who don't understand what's happening and they're being manipulated and abused, there's one guy who writes home. He got off the boat in New York City, signed up, and managed to get $750. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it very, very well. So again, I don't want to create too many kind of villains and heroes here. But what ends up happening by late '64 and into 1865 is you continue to have this depleting support for the war, for the Union war effort. If you want your last great example of it, it comes with Lincoln's re-election in the fall of 1864, when overwhelmingly the North decides that Lincoln is the man who has the plan to win this war. Irish Catholics come out overwhelmingly against Lincoln. The 6th Ward in New York goes 90% for George McClellan, which is slightly reminiscent of voting early and often. I don't really know anybody that goes out 90%, but they're not the only ward doing that. But they are clearly against the Northern war effort, and they definitely think Lincoln has the plan. So what will end up happening in the post-war period is that veterans will start to get increasingly frustrated that that image at the top of the New York Times and Harper's weekly portrayal of exactly how St. Patrick's Day is celebrated, rum, blood, and the day we celebrate, 1867, that is what Irish Catholic veterans start to get frustrated about. That's your memory. That's what you remember of what we did. You don't remember the sacrifices. You don't remember Antietam. You don't remember Fredericksburg. You don't remember Gettysburg. And it's after the war that you start to have the raising of monuments at places like Gettysburg. That's the Father Corby statue that's placed at Gettysburg. That is when the veterans start to get increasingly involved with wanting to point out that it wasn't that they didn't support the United States. They just didn't support the United States that Lincoln was trying to create. Okay? But the problem is, when they were such outspoken critics of Lincoln, once he's assassinated, it's like being an outspoken critic of Christ. It just does not win you a lot of friends, particularly in the North. In the South, yes, but not in the North. And so what happens is Irish Catholics in post-war America, they're not going to see a lot of changes, a lot of improvements based on their military service during the war. Okay? What they'll do is get involved with the schools. They'll get involved with the fundraising for monuments placements on battlefields. They'll publish their memoirs. Father Corby publishes his memoirs solely focused, not just on Irishmen, but solely focused on making sure the word gets out on what Catholics did for the country. Okay? And because what they want to create is this image that will challenge a lot of these political cartoons, where if you see, kind of I zoomed in there on that corner over there, the Tammany ring, kind of, again, these kind of Irish characteristics of the Democratic wing of the party, is right there with the Klan coming in and attacking this kind of noble defense of the Republicans. Okay? Or this one, where when Hancock's running and trying to get the soldier vote, you have a portrayal of kind of a Democratic Irish political rough right there next to a Confederate veteran. And that was their frustration, that we were more likely to be associated with Confederate veterans, we're more likely to be associated with the Klan, even though we're veterans of the Union, than ever any sort of romantic or truthful memory of what we did. This is what they were shooting for. And this is what they managed to get. But it's not because they fought and convinced people that they were loyal and true. It's because they did what a lot of groups figure out you have to do. If it's anything worth having, you're going to have to go out and take it for yourself. And what they do is they figure out the democratic process, and they figure out how to defend their own interests. And that is how they end up shaping the memory of Irish Catholic soldiers in the Civil War. And thank you very much.
In your presentation, am I to assume correctly the Irish Brigade are all immigrants? There's no Native Americans there?
Oh, no. If you look at the 116th Pennsylvania, you can find native-born Americans. For when the 29th Mass was in the Irish Brigade, yeah, that was an interesting thing. When Marg goes to give a real rallying speech about the Irish Catholic fight in America, and it's the 29th Mass actually got put in before the 28th did, and they're a bunch of Protestants from Boston. So he has to tone it down a little bit, but they end up getting along. They get along just fine. No. You can find native-born. I mean, the 116th Pennsylvania was half German. So no. There's definitely native-born, but the Irish Brigade, Mulligan's Brigade, the 9th Mass, like a lot. You see this with the German units too. They were very attractive to immigrants who either wanted to make sure their service would be recognized. Okay, so that there would be the spotlight on what this immigrant group soldier is doing, or it's because they want to serve with folks who share a lot of their traditions. For the Irish soldiers, it was a big deal that they really would want a Catholic chaplain, or they didn't want to serve under a native-born officer. So, I mean, that's going to help increase the number of immigrants within those units. But if you want to say that there's not any native-borns in the Irish Brigade, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I know the Irish Catholics, they were basically, so many of them were immigrants, right out the boat, so to speak. And there were a lot of Irish Catholics for the Confederacy. Were they going through similar problems?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, the nativism, sure. I mean, look, it's the mid-19th century. There's plenty of prejudice to go around for everybody. But if you look at the Confederacy, they have a much smaller population, Irish Catholic population, definitely around New Orleans. Savannah has a significant Irish Catholic population. It's funny, though, because the Irish Confederates could not wrap their heads around why Northern Irish Catholics would support the Union, right? Especially Fenians. Like, look, the Fenian movement is all about saying we have the right to break away and be our own country. How could you fight for a government that is stopping an entity from wanting to break away and be on their own? They absolutely did not understand that argument whatsoever. David Gleason, by the way, has a chapter on them. I have an edited collection coming out this fall, and David Gleason's writing a whole book right now on Irish Catholic Confederates. It's going to be good.
In your research, did you ever run into numbers of men who actually went back to Ireland to use their military skills for Ireland?
In the late 1860s, there's two efforts. There's two Fenian raids into Canada. That's mainly where you see it. But yeah, you do find folks who go back to Ireland. They're recruiting in Ireland to launch these types of uprisings. There's some good stories in the consular records about when these guys end up in jail and they're trying to say, I'm an American citizen and I'm not really doing what you think I'm doing, and no. But no, I mean there are two efforts in the 1860s, and it's neat because there's so much animosity against the British government in the North after the war, because there's this image that the British were always backing the Confederacy. That when folks hear about the Fenian efforts, at first there's a certain amount of sympathy that, yeah, some group wants to mess with the British. Look, yeah, we're going to back that. But when it actually comes to supplying them with weapons and real support, no, the federal government isn't going to go that far. But it's a fascinating window in there where there's this brief little kind of hiccup of, oh yeah, we're with you again. And then you start to kind of fade back into a lot of the old prejudices. And it's not really clear why those prejudices go away. One of my theories is that you have a whole new wave of immigrants coming in the 1880s, and the Irish have been here long enough that now the fear is it's the Italian Catholics and the Jews coming in who are changing everything. So I don't know. I don't really know why they fade, but it takes a heck of a long time. And from what I found, it did not fade because of military service. I feel like I had my back to you all the whole time. Yes?
You gave information on the civilian Irish vote, of course, like every election. What about the soldier Irish vote?
Still went, that's a really good question, still went for McClellan. Even when the whole argument, right, is that like 80% of Union soldiers go for Lincoln, Irish Catholics are still going for McClellan. I mean, look, even though Lincoln isn't running technically as a Republican in 1864, right, for the Irish Catholics, I mean, we were just talking about this over dinner. I mean, the Republican Party, that's the party that the Know-Nothings have belonged to. That's the party of nativism. The Democratic Party is the party that has always welcomed immigrants. They're not going to back the Republicans. It's viewed as it's the party of the abolitionists, it's the party of the nativists, it's the party that has done basically everything possible to threaten us in the United States. There's no way large numbers of them were ever going to support Lincoln. You can find examples, you can find pockets, but no, they stayed opposed to Lincoln through the bitter end. And again, that's one of the problems, is that they remain outspoken critics of Lincoln, and when he gets assassinated, Lee surrenders on Palm Sunday, Lincoln gets assassinated on Good Friday. He really does take on this martyred Christ-like symbol right after the war, and anybody who not only was an outspoken critic before he died, but continued to be. It's kind of like criticizing Robert E. Lee in the South after the war. I mean, you're not going to win that fight. And it's a problem, but they are absolutely determined, because within their argument, within their communities, what they've figured out is playing the game isn't getting us anywhere. And what we're going to have to do is stick with what we know works. And what they have figured out is how to organize and get what they need for themselves.
Sir, please.
Doctor, I wondered myself the lack of acceptance of the Irish Brigade was because of the Catholic, or the fact that they did not fluent in English in a lot of cases.
Right. For the soldiers within the brigade, most of them overwhelmingly are going to be fluent in English. You can still find some Gaelic speakers, absolutely. But for the most part, they're absolutely going to be. And again, it's not so much that the Irish Brigade isn't always being accepted. It's the image that the Irish Brigade is being needlessly sacrificed. Okay? And not praised as much as native-born. But there generally was always an impressive recognition of just how good they were. I mean, they were clearly an elite unit. Nobody doubted that. But what ends up happening, and what this is all about, is that memory, Father Corby with the 88th New York, what the Irish Brigade does at Antietam, at Fredericksburg, that gets overshadowed by the draft riots, by St. Patrick's Day, by all of the old nativism that completely overshadows it. So during the post-war period, their fight is to make that image stand out.
In the back.
Dr. Uter, were there any Irish units that participated outside the Eastern Theater?
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, sure. All sorts. But I mean, for the most part, overwhelmingly you're going to see them in the East. And for the most part, that's because your largest Irish Catholic populations are New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, Right behind that, you get Chicago, then St. Louis. But overwhelmingly, they're going to be recruited and serve within the Eastern Theater. But you can find all sorts of Irishmen serving in the West. They also are going to have some of their strongest complaints in the West. Some of the reports coming out of Iowa and Illinois are where you're going to have some very, very strong complaints that, you know, we're being needlessly sacrificed, we're not being appreciated, these types of things. A lot of complaints about serving under native-born officers, non-Irish Catholic. When I say native-born, I'm generally referring to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So you're going to have much larger numbers of that service in the East.
I was wondering in your research if you did any study in regard to Lincoln and his attitude toward Catholicism and to Catholics, in that I know from studies I've done in the past, and being from the state of Illinois originally, he defended a priest who left Chiniki, he was Father Chiniki when he was a Catholic priest, in St. Anne, Illinois, and he was taken to court, this was in probably the 1840s or 50s, by the Catholic Church, because most of the congregation then became Protestant too in the community in Illinois, and Lincoln defended him, and Lincoln won, and they were able to continue as a Protestant church. He was able to leave the priesthood. But he supposedly warned Lincoln that the Catholic Church would ultimately kill him. That was planned early, and he would have been warned from that point on.
Assassinated or politically killed?
Assassinated.
Assassinated?
Killed. The Jesuits would kill him. And then, interesting enough, it's nothing else to give him. That was the black eye.
Yeah.
It's the fact that Booth was a Catholic and all this planning on the canon. So they were really the honorable.
Yeah. Lincoln, honestly, his approach to Catholics would, I think, be Lincoln's classic approach to any political group. He's one of the most politically astute and savvy politicians I've ever studied. And I mean, he would go out of his way over and over again to point out that there's no targeting of immigrants, there's no targeting of Catholics. And for the most part, I think he was generally speaking, being honest with that. So no, I don't see Lincoln going out of his way at all to attack the Catholics. If there's any sort of kind of animosity toward Lincoln in particular within the Catholic population, that's fairly common within the 1860s. I mean, we didn't start loving Lincoln until after he died.
Hey, how you doing? One quick question. You mentioned the perception amongst the Irish on that they were making more of a sacrifice than the rest of the soldiers. Is there any validity to their perception? What were their casualty rates compared to other native-born soldiers?
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you look at an elite group like the Irish Brigade, okay, absolutely. I mean, they were suffering horrendous casualties. But so was the Iron Brigade. If you want to look at the Confederates, so was the Texas Brigade. I mean, that's what happens with elite units. I mean, you use them because they're so good, and you usually put them in very difficult spots. If you just want to look at the Irish Brigade, no, I don't think you've got a case that the Irish Brigade was being purposely sacrificed because people didn't value them. If anything, the Irish Brigade was being used because officers did value them. They really did. The problem is when you're dealing with a group, with this Irish Catholic population who, through their heritage in Ireland, as well as dealing with nativism in the United States, they are very sensitive to, and in many cases rightly so, to groups really treading on their rights, their communities. And they're going to be very, very sensitive to this. And so, yeah, you can find reports of, Irish Catholic soldiers being mistreated within camps as far as their Catholic faith, being targeted for things like that. But as far as clear examples of Irish Catholic units being sent in and purposely slaughtered, no. But what you can find are these, the best example I could give you probably off the top of my head is the Enrollment Act. That's going to be one of their biggies. You specifically said as long as we weren't citizens, we wouldn't be targeted, and now you just changed the rule right at the last second. And you say we've got 65 days to get out of the country when none of us can afford to get out of the country. They're going to, something like that, they're going to take, and there's a certain nugget of truth to it. Now, it applies to all immigrants. It's not just Irish Catholics, right? But Irish Catholics are one of the largest immigrant populations in the country at that time period, and they're going to take that as very specific targeting. So, yes and no is the answer.
Any other questions?
General McClellan was
Yeah.
a very strong supporter of General Hancock's
Yeah.
effort before, and Hancock, I believe, only missed the election by like New York or something like that. So that would kind of show that there was a lot of Irish backing, someone,
A Democratic candidate, yeah. But he was a Democratic candidate. So, yeah, but I mean, it shows to me one thing by the 1880s, they have learned how to organize. They really, and it's fascinating because in the process of protecting their own interests, they're Americanizing. They're figuring, they're adapting, they're assimilating. They're somewhat Irishizing, if you will, on St. Patrick's Day, the process at the same time. But yeah, I mean, they turn out in huge numbers. And Mulholland, I'm sure you've read his work. I mean, he's one of the most eloquent, beautiful writers and speakers. And he's a fabulous voice for the memory of Irish Catholic soldiers. He's hugely involved with Father Corby and a lot of that after the war. He's a huge asset.
And speaking about the assassination, the Catholic link there, did that have a lot of legs in, American perceptions of Catholics?
Not my understanding of it, no. Could be, but no. No, I've never seen, in the midst of the conspiracies, yes, I mean, it is one of the stronger conspiracies, but as far as having any real truth to it, no.
I just meant the number of conspirators that were Catholic and fleeing to the Vatican.
I don't know. No, you know what? I should just beyond the basics of it, I don't know. I've never traced it as far as that route. So no. This is what I was telling Michael, you learn with Civil War history. I don't know. But now I'm curious and I have to find out.
Have you looked into the bitterness in western New England because of the Irish riots and so forth that exist even today?
No, I mean, I've looked into it in Pennsylvania. I mean, a lot of the resistance within Schuylkill, those kind of areas there in 1864, but never in western New England. Whereabouts are you talking?
Well, I'm talking about communities such as Great Barrington as opposed to, Boston.
Right.
Boston,
Right.
Which is largely Irish.
Right.
They were pushed west.
Yeah.
And a lot of the descendants of Civil War soldiers still bear bitterness.
All right. I got to look it up. Thank you.
Anyone else? One other quick one.
Yeah.
Colonel Dennis Henan was a family relative. Yeah, he was our great-great-grandfather.
You're kidding me.
Yeah. Actually made General Mulholland my great-great-uncle.
Right, exactly, yeah. The marriage, yeah.
Colonel's daughter.
Huh.
Was there anything you can tell me in particular, what your research
About Henan?
on his early...
Just that Henan is a superb recruiter, well-liked by his men, well-respected, good commander. But as far as Henan, I don't know as much about Henan as I do about Mulholland. I did much more with Mulholland. But, yeah, oh, exactly. Yeah. But no, not as much with me. With Henan, other than the fact that just a superb recruiter, well-respected as a commander, well-respected within the field, and with the memory of the war active within that. And that's where I really used him within the book.
He was still active. I'm sorry, he was still active. Even after Fredericksburg, say, a lot of it shifted the loyalties or the passion, if you will. But yet his articles show, he was still actively recruiting for them and offering, veteran corps to the service.
He absolutely is. The problem is...
Even though he was a strong, Fenian Brotherhood supporter also.
Well, but the Fenian Brotherhood argument is still going to be a strong one, that we still need more and more men getting military experience, training. We need to create a corps of veterans. I mean, that's in a lot of ways what they were trying to do. Now, the downside of that is going to be great, but all of the guys we're getting trained are going to be dead, so this isn't working really well. But no, I mean, you get this, how do I describe this? The problem by the time you get to 64 is that I don't want to give the impression that men like Henan, men like McClellan, men like Nugent, they are strong, long-time supporters. I mean, they fundamentally believe in what they're doing. The problem is they're increasingly exceptions, and they cannot recruit the base that they could get in 61, 62. And the main reason for that is that starting in the fall of 62, those Union war aims split from the Irish war aims. And it wasn't just the Emancipation Proclamation, but when you throw in Fredericksburg and the draft riots, the increased sense that this is not our war, we're being forced to serve in it, and it's not helping our interests, that creates problems. And even guys like Henan can't get the numbers that they used to be able to get. And again, the men who are coming in, they're not assimilating as well into the unit. A lot of the veterans view them as purely financially motivated. And it's not necessarily an uncommon problem throughout a lot of units, but it becomes an issue within the Irish Brigade.
The two words no Irishman wants to hear, last call. All right, two at the same time, so sir, you get that.
I have a question regarding Philadelphia, in particular, in the immediate aftermath of Gettysburg. Was there any recognition in the newspapers in Philadelphia for the efforts of the 69th Pennsylvania, which bore most of the brunt of Pickett's charge?
I don't know if they bore most of the brunt of Pickett's charge, but the 69th Pennsylvania would tell you that. But they fought very, very well. Absolutely. Oh yeah, that's all over the newspapers. Absolutely. But again, that's their whole complaint, is that we did fight well. We did amazing things. And after the war, all we're remembered for is destroying orphanages, just horrific things. And the argument is because we're Irish and we're Catholics, and we won't give that up. And so they are a real force to reckon with within the whole memory movement of the war, into really trying to reclaim that. And that's where you get that idea that Irishmen served to prove their loyalty and gain acceptance. No, it was afterwards that they said, we served, we deserve to be accepted. But it's not really until afterwards that they start to say that. But okay, the 69th is being covered in all the newspapers, 69th Pennsylvania, and did the incredible work they did on the third day.
Could you comment about a dichotomy? First of all, the plot to assassinate Lincoln was pretty much hatched in Maryland, okay, which is regarded as a Catholic state.
Right.
The ease with which John Surratt escapes and ends up becoming a papal guard in the Vatican. In contrast to, some years later, lots of people think that Hancock lost the election because of his judicial involvement with the hanging of the first woman in America who was a Catholic. Mm-hmm. You see the contrast? I
think it has to do with the grassy knoll, is what I think.
Something for you.
Hey, I gotta carry this stuff. Yeah, I have to hold everything.
Well, Dr. Earl, this has been a very exciting time for those of us who claim Irish heritage. But those of us who are historians also have a great time at Gettysburg, and you can't think about Gettysburg without thinking about the Irish Brigade. But you've given us so much more than just the Irish Brigade and Gettysburg. You've taught all of us who are Irish, and all of you who wish you were, a little bit more about our heritage. And for that, we'd like to present you, on behalf of Colonel Martin Viney, our director, and the entire staff here at the AHEC, we'd like to present this to you. This is a reduced copy of your poster, and thank you for your lecture.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.